As Aijaz, Ahmad and Prabhat Patnaik have dealt with many facets of the last 2 decades since the end of the Soviet Union, it has made my job easier. We have seen in the last 2 decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, imperialist globalization and the new liberal regime being spread all over the world. And imperialism, in order to sustain this, has become more aggressive, has resorted to sanctions, blockades, and the use of military force around the world. And we have to ask ourselves, 2 decades after the end of the Soviet Union, where is imperialism today? What has happened to imperialism? And with the end of the 20th century socialism as we knew it, what are the prospects for socialism in the 21st century? I think it's within this framework, between these 2 parameters, that we have to discuss the role of the left today internationally, the positioning of the left, and what is the program of action that the left has to undertake. Aijaz referred to the tremendous increase in the aggressiveness of imperialism headed by the United States of America. We are just seeing the end of the last phase of the NATO military intervention in Libya. And before that, we had seen the historic popular uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt. And the United States was taken aback by the sudden revolt in Tunisia and Egypt. But today, it is back on the scene, the United States and its NATO allies, with the slogan that they are protecting human rights, they are helping restoration of democracy and liberty in Libya. They have maneuvered to now hijack what is called the Arab Spring. But underlying this latest NATO intervention in Libya is the other grim reality, that this intervention has taken place in the Middle East, which has long been under imperialist domination, colonial and then imperialist domination. And if you see the countries of the Middle East, which have the biggest oil reserves, if you rank them in the order of their oil richness, it starts with Saudi Arabia, then you have Iran, third you have Iraq, fourth you have Kuwait, fifth you have the UAE, the Gulf states, and sixth you have Libya. Now with this Libyan intervention, only Iran remains outside the grip of imperialism and the United States. All the other 5 Arab countries which have the biggest oil reserves have been under their control and have come under its control now. So you have the 2 sides. Since the beginning of this year, you saw the popular revolt It may be that, as Aijaz said, Egypt may end up with an outcome where there may be an agreement between the Egyptian army and the Muslim Brotherhood, etc. But I think there is also a positive aspect to what happened in Egypt. Today, if in the United Nations, the question of the membership of Palestine is being debated and voted upon, and it is getting widespread support, it is linked to the shift that took place in the Middle East and as a consequence of what happened in Egypt. The fact that in Palestine, the Hamas and Fatah had to come to an agreement for unity, despite being bitterly divided, was because of what happened in Egypt. The opening of the Rafah crossing to break the blockade of Gaza is also because of what happened in Egypt, the popular uprising in Egypt. So what I am trying to say is that in the present day world, there is no doubt that imperialism has been on the offensive. Imperialism has become more aggressive, more desperate, in fact more reckless, because there is no countervailing power of the Soviet Union. But at the same time, while we recognize that from the post-1991 period, we have seen the retreat of socialism worldwide. The retreat of socialism is visible in various manifestations around the world. In the weakening of the forces of the left, political parties which adhere to communism and socialism, all this has happened. But at the same time, by the end of the second decade, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we can also see resistance to imperialist hegemony and imperialist globalization and the disastrous effects of neoliberal policies growing around the world and building up around the world. And therefore, I think for the left, and when I use the term left, I'll come to that, the recognition that imperialism today in the 21st century is as exploitative, is as dangerous, as threatening to the national independence and sovereignty of countries around the world, and constitutes the direct source of exploitation of the working people around the world. This recognition has to be basic for the left. This is what demarcates the left from all other political forces. But unfortunately, in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, we saw the retreat of socialism and its consequences. Aijaz gave a very pessimistic picture of what's happening in Europe today. And that is the reality. Even today, if you read the popular literature, you read the newspapers, you look at the media, they talk about the social democrats as the left in Europe. The left means the social democrats. The communists are hardly there. Now, what are these social democrats? We have seen in the 1980s onwards, the social democrats shifted more to the right. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they have shifted fully to the right. They've embraced the neoliberal ideology. They've embraced the aims and designs of imperialism and NATO. You had the New Labour in Britain and Blairism. Is that left? Can that be called the left in Britain today? I don't think anybody can call them left. I don't think they would like to be called the left also. That is why they call themselves New Labour. They don't even call themselves New Left. So, see the German Social Democratic Party, the successors of the old historic German Social Democratic Party, the biggest working class communist party in Europe. That party is today on the right. Today in Greece, this onslaught on the Greek people, the austerity measures are being implemented by a socialist government, PASOK. PASOK, what was it in the 1960s, I remember, in Europe. And the PASOK today, how is it different from any of the other right-wing parties in Europe? In Spain, the austerity measures against which vast masses of young people have come out in the streets is against the socialist government's austerity measures. So there is no doubt that the retreat from socialism has had its most disastrous impact in Europe first, where the Social Democrats, which were broadly kept on the left earlier, is today no more left. And you have this huge vacuum. And despite that, the struggles are developing in Europe. Mention was made about Greece. Now, Greece is at the focal point of the crisis in Europe today. The crisis of the debt crisis, the euro crisis, and the fact that in Greece you have this tremendous resistance put up by the working class, led by the working class, and then all other sections of the people. Every day there are strikes and there are huge popular demonstrations and protests and clashes with the police all over Greece. In fact, they're going in for a major general strike action again in the coming days, because every second or third month new attacks and new measures are being instituted, austerity measures, cutting into the wages, cutting into the pensions, cutting into the social benefits, and cutting jobs in Greece today. But in that Greece, that resistance is possible because there is a strong communist party even today, which can get 10% of the vote. It is because in Greece there is a very strong organized trade union and working class movement. The PAME, I've been there in Greece a few years ago and seen how this confederation of trade unions is leading the fight against the neoliberal policies and the EU attacks launched on the working people. Now, the Greek Communist Party and the left, broadly the left in Greece, those who are not only the Communist Party but there are other left parties, are all demanding Greece come out of the European Union. Greece abandon the euro and Greece cancel the debt. They default on the debt. We say we cancel the debt, just like Argentina did earlier. Now, here you have just the contours of a political movement, which can pose an alternative to the present neoliberal regime in Greece. But this is not the situation all over Europe, unfortunately. What we have are struggles of the working people, struggles by students, struggles by youth, which are primarily defensive measures to defend what they have, the rights that they have gained over decades in the 20th century. Cuts in pension, cuts in wages, cuts in unemployment benefits, health, etc. And those struggles are important, those struggles are there, but in the absence of a political agency, a political force which can organize all these movements and struggles and give it a direction, which can pose an alternative. In that absence, we are not able to see any headway being made in most of the European countries. And for that, we have to blame a big section of the left which was there in Europe. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not the trigger which led to what I would call the decomposition of the left and the communist left also in Europe. If you see the history of the Italian Communist Party, the biggest communist party in Europe, which had many more members than even our Communist Party, the United Communist Party had, where is it today? It has disappeared. There you saw the process that the Social Democrats moved to the right, and then the Communist Party started moving to the right, taking the place of the Social Democrats. And the Italian Communist Party, by the 1980s, had made up its mind that we should be good Social Democrats. They had a very big leader, Berlinguer, Enrico Berlinguer. And Berlinguer said, let's work for a historic compromise with the Christian Democrats, because they represent also the Catholic Church. They're a Christian party. The communists and the Christians, we can have a historic compromise. And Berlinguer said, we feel safe because NATO, we are part of the NATO alliance. Even my party feels safe, he said, the Italian Communist Party. Disarmed themselves in one stroke. Their anti-imperialism went. In another stroke, they declared that they're aspiring to be a social democratic party. And that Italian Communist Party's latest avatar became the party of the democratic left, then they dropped the left, then they became the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party achieved what the Italian Communist Party could not achieve, because imperialism and the Italian bourgeoisie had decided at no cost, though the communists could get 32% of the vote, they cannot be in government at any time. Later on, converting themselves as servitors of the Italian bourgeoisie and of imperialism, they have been in the government. They have even had a prime minister. So here is a country with this rich tradition where the working class, the peasantry, all sections of the people, where the culture, Italian culture, the cultural field was dominated by the left, is today having Berlusconi as the prime minister. The postmodern prime minister, they call him, who controls the entire media, the television. All these television channels are owned by him. This is what Italy has been reduced to. And you have still the workers fighting against cuts. Millions of workers go on strike to defend their rights. But politically, no possibility of change. And there is not a single communist in the Italian parliament for the first time since the Second World War in the last elections, because all of them have got fragmented into small groups. So what I'm saying is, for the reconstitution of the left, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Asia or in Africa or Latin America, the cardinal principle is, do you recognize that there is a thing called imperialism still? Some of them seem to have assumed that once socialism disappeared or the Soviet Union disappeared, imperialism has also disappeared. That seems to be the logic that they have followed. And today, when you have imperialism becoming more and more aggressive, I'm not going into that aspect. Yes, the weakening of the United States of America, the long-term decline of America as an economic power, has not weakened its military might or weakened its resolve to continue to dominate, to continue to lead the imperialist bloc and to use its power with impunity, with aggression all over the world. But when Libya is attacked by NATO, you find sections of the non-communist left in Europe saying this is an intervention, a humanitarian intervention. This is an intervention to uphold the democratic liberties of the Libyan people. NATO is bringing democracy to Libya. There are people who call themselves left in Europe who are openly supporting the NATO intervention. There are people in France who call themselves socialists who do this. So I'm saying first thing is, in the present day world, the left as it exists, the left where it's playing a role, is acting and is conducting struggles only when they have this anti-imperialist perspective. And while Europe is definitely presenting a dismal picture in this sense, the contrast you can see in Latin America. In Latin America today, after all, as Aijaz said, neoliberalism came first to Latin America. From Chile onwards, you could see in the 1980s, it was the laboratory where all the experiments were conducted. And it is there that the struggles against privatization and liberalization started much before what we had to face in India. And it is an accumulation of all those struggles of different sections of the people of different countries in Latin America, that finally, after more than 2 decades, resulted in the political changes which took place in the Latin American continent. And in that, 2 countries stand out, which is Venezuela and Bolivia. I'm not talking about Cuba, of course. Cuba is an exception all through. And you have today the left in these 2 countries who say that socialism is possible. Chavez, when he got elected as the first time as the president, for the first 6 years he didn't talk about socialism. He started talking about socialism only 6 years later. And he said, yes, we can. This is a process of socialist process that we are undertaking in Venezuela. And there is a political movement there which openly declares that we want to work for socialism. We want to fight imperialist hegemony in Venezuela and Latin America. We reject the neoliberal policies and we try to put in place alternatives. Now this is happening not smoothly. There are a lot of problems in this process in Venezuela. A lot of difficulties are going to be faced because they have won 13 elections. Presidential election, provincial assembly elections, etc., referendums, you see. Now we have also been winning a number of elections in West Bengal. So we know what problems come, what difficulties come. Whatever you do in these elections, we could never, 45% of people would always oppose us. We have got 51% of the vote in Bengal, but that still meant nearly 48, 49% didn't vote for us. So in Venezuela also, there is going to be resistance to this, what is happening. But there is a process which is on in Venezuela, which shows that in the present day age, in the backyard of America, in Latin America, you can have socialist processes and experiments. It can arise. I can't say what will happen eventually in Venezuela. There are so many imponderables. The party where Chavez has formed, the United Socialist Party, how far it can really consolidate and become an effective organizational force, all these questions are there. And in Bolivia also, more amazing, a more backward country where 60% of the people are indigenous people, what we would call tribal people. You have an elected president and a government which belongs to a movement which says we are the movement for socialism. They call their party the movement for socialism. You have a vice president there who says, I am a Marxist. And I think Marxism can be applied to the conditions of Bolivia, and Marxism has to be creatively applied to understand what indigenous peoples are, what their communities are, and how do we go forward, which cannot be the model which has been there. Marxism has been applied in many other countries. So I'm just taking two examples to tell you that, yes, there has been the setbacks to socialism, there has been a retreat from socialism, but in the last 2 decades, the balance sheet is not purely negative. There are forces working, there are struggles and movements developing. But here, as I said, there will be no clear-cut steps of here, we are going forward. Sometimes you may have to face setbacks. But I am not so pessimistic as Aijaz is about what happened in the Middle East, for example, because whatever said and done, he knows more because he has lived in Egypt. I read recently that 4 left parties have got together and formed an alliance. Though they're maybe very weak now. But it's the first time they had an opportunity to work openly. Otherwise, the Communist Party was severely repressed, not now, from the days of Nasser. And a section of that party had surrendered and said, we joined Nasser's Arab Socialist Party. You see. But today, again, the left is regrouping. And there is after all, the Egyptian popular uprising was not just merely a Facebook and Twitter revolution. Behind that were 3-4 years of working class ferment, and millions of Egyptian workers had gone into struggles, strike struggles. The Tunisian popular revolt was not just because one young man burnt himself after being ill-treated or humiliated. You'll find that that popular uprising, the backbone of that uprising was the Tunisian Union of General Workers, the UGTT, which was considered to be a very reformist federation, but the various units of this union took the lead and started organizing strikes and paralyzed Tunisia. So out of this, as both Aijaz and Prabhat said, out of all these struggles, something will emerge. I'm confident of that. And it's already emerging to the extent that today, if Israel is feeling isolated more today, it's also because what happened in Egypt. Whatever comes in Egypt today, it cannot go back to I think, the period of Anwar Sadat and the 1970s. There will be changes. So, Libya, yes, but Libya was, after all, the lesson to be learnt by even authoritarian rulers who earlier would take a stand against imperialism and talk about national sovereignty is, if you surrender to them, you will finally find yourself disposable. After all, Gaddafi had struck a deal with the West after the 9/11 and surrendered to the West, and they find him now dispensable. So today, in the world, there is no countervailing the Soviet Union, and I'm coming to the last part of my thing, I'm taking too much time, I think, talking about socialism, and that is the other part for the left, which Prabhat also touched upon. I think that many of you come from a generation, of course, which is free from the baggage that we have. But when we talk of socialism today, we must be clear about something, which is that there is no going back to the socialism of the 20th century. The Bolshevik Revolution and the formation of the Soviet Union took place in a particular historical conjuncture. Lenin said that was at that time the weakest link in the imperialist chain. So, and the model and the path followed in the Soviet Union to build socialism under siege by world capitalism, under attack, civil war, encirclement, etc. That model cannot be the model to pursue in the 21st century. I'm not going into the details of that. What I'm saying is, there is rich experience of socialism in the 20th century. I'm not going into the emancipatory role that socialism played in the 20th century. It's a tremendous role. But out of that legacy and experience, we have to decide what is that we need to continue with, which we own up and carry forward and build, and that we need to discard. Not discard because of any moral or political judgment. You discard because it is irrelevant today. It cannot be adopted or carried forward today. So that is an issue which has engaged us in the last 2 decades. And as if you have the long historical view, 2 decades is not a very long time for you to come to terms with a great historical defeat and a debacle. So in these two decades, yes, there has been rethinking. And I believe there will be a socialism for the 21st century. And in that socialism, like in the 20th century, fight against imperialism will remain. That is not something which has to be discarded. All those sections of the left who have drawn the wrong lesson will be on the wrong side of history also, I'm sure. And secondly, in the fight against today, this tremendous onslaught by capitalism, by imperialist globalization, for the left today, I think another thing should not, what is sought to be discarded is to write off the working class. Yes, there has been restructuring of capitalism and its production systems, and there have been changes in the structure of the working class. And you have today a vast mass of people who are wage labor, who are broadly the laboring classes, who are not directly industrial workers in that sense. Aijaz raised that question. If you read Lenin says very clearly, when he talks about the proletariat, he says the proletariat consists of various sections. So he doesn't talk about only the industrial workers. He says, yes, there is the industrial workers, then there is, he said, between the proletariat and the semi-proletariat, various other strata. Now, some of them have proliferated. And in our own experience, where we are developing, we're trying to organize the working class, we know that a big section is outside the formal industrial production structure in factories. But they are to be organized. They are facing this intensive exploitation. In India also we are seeing the same process. And there is a change in the composition of the working class movement in India. If you check up the trade union, not just the left trade unions, all the trade unions, you will find the majority of the members of the trade unions today come from what is called the unorganized sector or the informal sector. So they have to be organized, and they have to be organized in new ways. They cannot be organized like in the factory flow of the old days. In Latin America, in fact, the strength of the left today is because they have organized them as communities living where they are living, in these vast slums. In Caracas, you go, the slums of Caracas, I think most of the people live in slums there, in the hillsides. They are the force which is behind Chavez today. They're organized. They're organized not only in trade unions, they're organized in local community organizations. And they are networked through that process also. Now, there are new ways of organizing also. And therefore, when I talked about socialism in a new sense, we're also talking about politics, organization, and movements in a new sense also. That will be there, characteristic of the 21st century. Here in India, we had an advantage, which was pointed out by Aijaz, which is that we did not directly experience the dismantling effects of the Soviet Union. Many parties got dismantled in Europe, but we escaped that fate. We didn't escape that fate because of any particular special discipline in the party. As generally is heard, that we have a very regimented party so that people don't think for themselves. We escaped because we were aware of the imperfections of the Soviet Union also. We were aware of the imperfections of the Soviet model of socialism. And because a big section of the communist movement in India had said, yes, we stand by the legacy of the Bolshevik Revolution, of the Soviet Union as a socialist state, but we are very clear that they have departed from that. They have deviated from that. They have gone on a path which is leading them into crisis and trouble. And we do not accept that as our model. We will apply Marxism to Indian conditions and work out our own path. So neither the Soviet Union nor the People's Republic of China can show us the way. We were clear about that. That is why any developments, any setbacks, yes, in a general sense, in terms of political, ideological, yes, we have to come to terms with that. But we did not suffer the disintegrative aspects. But that is not sufficient. That is not sufficient. Because we tried to work out independently what should be our path, we were able to recognize the Indian realities and work out our own strategy and tactics. And one of that is, of course, one of the elements which Prabhat talked about, the democratic basis of our politics and our polity. How do we address that in a country where parliamentary democracy has deep roots among the people? We have not shunned that. We have engaged with that. We have tackled that. Similarly, I think that the Indian left, and here I'm being non-partisan or non-sectarian, I would include in the Indian left all those who recognize that the fight for a better society, for social transformation, requires a fight against imperialism also, one. Two, that we have in our country, you have a ruling class, you have a bourgeoisie. I was reading the other day, I think it was Joyati Ghosh which has written, how we are buying up millions of acres of land in Africa, Indian companies now, just like the other countries are doing. Our bourgeoisie, our companies are going up and buying thousands and thousands of acres of land in various African countries. Now this is a bourgeoisie which is fully collaborating with imperialism. Sometimes it would go wrong, as we did in the past, some sections of the left, in trying to differentiate between different sections of our ruling classes, saying these people are progressive. They have an anti-imperialist component or anti-feudal component. So we can do business with them. I think that even if there was any possibility of that, that's over. It's not possible anymore. So here you have to fight against what we have, this obscene neoliberal order being sought to be imposed, which is brutally exploiting the people of our country and which is looting the natural resources of our country. You have to fight against that. And the third thing is what Prabhat referred to, what I put broadly in the rubric of social justice. Social justice in terms of the fight against caste oppression, gender, and other oppressions which we have, of myriads of oppressions in our social system. If these three streams are there, then that left, anti-imperialist, fight against the existing neoliberal order, and the third component, social justice. If that is taken forward, then the left will be able to make advances. And I think then the left will be able to link up with what is today stirring, and some shape is being given to some of these stirrings in places like Latin America. Will be part of that process. Thank you very much.
When Comrade Prakash said that the socialism of 21st century is going to be different from the socialism of the 20th century in terms of models, I thought that you're going to elaborate on that. I came to this meeting with that, because that is one of the fundamental reasons. I see that this there is no alternative campaign of neoliberalism or of capitalism at large, especially after the collapse of the USSR, of the Soviet Union, that it becomes imperative on the left to actually think in terms of the alternatives that exist, the socialist alternatives that exist. So somehow I feel slightly demoralized that you didn't elaborate on that.
I'm afraid that would require another session. And there are two problems with that. One, I'd require more time. Second, what is going to be 21st century socialism is right now under discussion. Serious discussion. If you want, I can refer to you, there is a lot of literature in Latin America now about what should be 21st century socialism. Unfortunately, much of it is in Spanish, which, unless it's been translated, but there is a very lively discussion going on in places like Brazil, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Argentina, about 21st century socialism. And that's because also the traditional communist parties are not very strong in Latin America. So all these forces who are there, who have embraced Marxism or are socialist, they are really, from their experience of the movements that developed in the last 2 decades, trying to define and position themselves as far as socialism is concerned. This is one aspect. The other is what is happening internationally all over. You see, I didn't get into the discussion about what's happening in China. Aijaz has made some very sweeping statements. Ferocious capitalism in China, growth. I would put it differently. I mean, I don't want to speak about it now because in my party we are going to engage in a discussion seriously about this whole question of socialism. And after 6 months or so, I may be able to tell you something. We are just in the process of discussion. It won't be proper for me to now say something which will be then seen to be as, the authoritative views of my party. So I don't want to go into that. But even according to me, what you have to see is happening in China, in Vietnam, even what Cuba will also have to undergo, I think, is also overall when there is this retreat from socialism worldwide. What do you do in these countries? There's a serious question. So I'm not going into that. I reserve my right to go into that later. But as far as 21st century socialism is concerned, I was only stating, linking it to the fact, for the left, to today orient itself in the background of what's happened after the fall of the Soviet Union, there are certain basic postulates or principles. And then I said, in India also what should be done. In India also what I set out is not the Indian socialist vision. I said what should be done as the ground to clear the way for socialism, going towards socialism. And in that I touched upon briefly that there are certain aspects of socialism, the experience of socialism in the 20th century we should not discard. We have to carry forward. So if somebody is, you're interested, we can discuss this in some other occasion in more detail.
So my question to Comrade Karat is that, as you have said that there will be a redefinement of socialism into 21st century. Now, how to propagate it? Because everything which comes to solution in India, what I feel to so far as my experience goes, is through parliamentary democracy, where the left has got a little position to express their ideas. And the media is mainly dominated by this class of people who only reflects their point of view and how it is going to benefit the people from their point of view, not looking into the basics. So has Comrade Karat and his team worked out on a base where this can be propagated on a broader aspect to all the people of the society who have an access to television or any different types of media? Thank you.
I said that in India we have had to come to grips with a situation where the basic political system and the political activities are centered around the parliamentary democratic system. How do you deal with that? We feel we have made some contribution to that, you see. We do not think we should negate the parliamentary democratic system. In terms of the historical development, the establishment of a parliamentary democratic system with our constitution in 1950, the formation of the republic, we do not see that as a negative thing, an obstacle. We see it as a step forward. And we are talking about taking that democratic process, deepening it and making it a more popular, meaning how to make it in genuine terms a more popular people's involvement and setup. I'm not going into that, but this aspect we have dealt with. So there is definitely in socialism, when we talk about socialism, the whole question about democracy within a socialist setup in the future, that is something which has definitely to be spelt out, learning from the experience of the 20th century. But I am somebody who will not negate what happened in building socialism, because in all these countries where revolutions took place, none of them had the luxury or the freedom to develop a democratic system in the way they would have liked, because they were constantly under attack and they sought to be subverted by imperialism, and they had to defend themselves, and that led to a certain type of what Prabhat talked about, one-party systems and regimes, you see. But I'm not talking about party alone, I'm talking about in socialism, how do you have democratic bodies, forums, where the people get involved in the decision making, both in terms of the administration, in terms of the economy and their daily lives. How do you set up these popular organs or bodies? That is very much democracy, not just the elected representative democracy we are talking about. That's an area in which definitely 21st century socialism will have to bring that also into its sphere.
Aijaz, want to say something?